ever, about God had, through His own agencies, created things to be used in His healing program. God created them, not man. Agencies to be used, and the herbs are from the Creator's hands. We're to use them for food. Genesis 1:29, I have given you every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, every tree in which is the fruit of the tree yielding seed, to you it shall be for meat or food. So the plants are to be used for food. That's what God's original intention was. The animals were not put here for food originally. Okay? Very clear from the Bible. Psalms 104:14, He causeth the grass to grow for the cattle, and the herb for the service of man, that he may bring forth food out of the earth, and so forth. So in any way that these plants can be used to man's service, God has ordained it. Right? Medicine, food, we use the herbs in other ways. You can see we use them for dyes, we use them for different articles that we use, rope making, right? We use it for wood, do we not? To burn, to keep us warm. We use it, I believe that this was an herb at one time, wasn't it? Right? Yeah, sure. For the service of man. For healing, 2 Kings 20, verse 7. This is for King Hezekiah. You remember the story of Hezekiah. Now this man was so sick he was going to die. You remember that story. And he turned his face to the wall, because Isaiah the prophet was sent to him to tell him, King Hezekiah, you're going to die. Get your house in order. And Hezekiah wept. He turned his face to the wall. And I believe that there is a message even in that for us. The message is coming. We're going to perish unless we repent. And we should turn our face to the wall and begin to weep and to plead with the Lord. Take my sins from me. Take my sins away. And in this matter, God heard Hezekiah's prayer. He wasn't haughty. He was humbled. And he pleaded with the Lord for mercy, and the Lord heard his prayer. Isaiah was not even out of the courtyard of the palace until the message came to Isaiah, go back and you tell the king, I've given him 15 extra years. And he didn't just stop there. The verse 7 says, Isaiah said, take a lump of figs. And they took and they laid it on the boil, and Hezekiah recovered. This man had a terminal illness. He was going to die. And a lump of figs was placed there, and the man recovered. So we have biblical evidence. Jesus, the way he worked, he used various methods of healing, didn't he? He used the clay, the spittle, He touched one, he spoke a word, he used the water. All of these natural things. The prophets. It was interesting to me. You remember when, in the apostles, you remember when these people would die, they would often stretch themselves over the body and breathe their life into them. You remember? How many here are familiar with CPR? A little different, but it's kind of similar. And remember Eutychus fell out of the window and Paul went down, stretched himself over that, warmed his body, breathed into him. Eutychus came to life. No, there is power in the life of Christ to resurrect, isn't there? There is power. God's green pharmacy, beyond man's comprehension. I want to just share a few other statements. This is from the book, The Green Pharmacy, by James Duke. James is on my mind. James Duke. Duke's his PhD. He was with the U.S. Department of Agricultural Service for years and has written extensively on these plant substances. He says there are some 300,000 higher plant species that are all chemically distinct, but fewer than 10% of them have been carefully screened for either their medicinal or their toxic constituents. 300,000 that we know about, and less than 10% have even been studied. A really good herbalist might know between 1,000 and 2,000 species, but rarely would they know more. And how many are there? 300,000. I wanted to just read to you a little bit of our counsels that we are given as a people. And do you notice how God doesn't contradict himself? Have you noticed that? Because if God is moving a people, he will give them biblical counsel. He will give them the inspired counsels from the testimonies, and he will give them true science. And they will all move in the same direction. All will line up, and then God's people, as a church, can move. And I believe the church is moving. The church is moving. Not everybody in the church is going to move, but the church is moving. Second Selected Messages, page 279. There are simple herbs and roots that every family may use for themselves and need not call a physician any sooner than they would call a lawyer. Okay? The Lord has provided antidotes for disease in simple plants. And these can be used by faith with no denial of faith. For by using the blessings that God has provided for our benefit, we cooperate with God. And that's what we want to do, isn't it? Cooperate with God. Second Selected Messages, again, 289. This is from Loma Linda Messages, page 316. There are many simple herbs which, if our nurses would learn the value of, they could use them in the place of drugs and find them very effective. By the way, Loma Linda Messages, who is that directed to? Well, it's to the church, but specifically to those at our sanitarium and school there, and then later our medical college, in terms of trying to direct that school as to how God wanted to treat the sick. And we've read these statements, I believe, before. It would have been better if from the very first drugs had been kept out of our sanitariums and use had been made of such simple remedies as are found in pure water, pure air, sunlight, and some of the simple herbs that are growing in the field. These would be just as efficacious as the drugs that are now used under mysterious names and concocted by human science. And they would leave no injurious effects in the system. That was Second Selected Messages, page 291. And you remember from our earlier talks together, what causes more deaths among humanity than all other causes combined. Drug medications. And even humanity recognizes, they say, they're somewhere between the fourth and the sixth leading cause of death, and that was back in the 90s. And since that time, the adverse reactions and deaths is just escalating. Now, I'm not going to bother you and burden you with how far back the use of herbs go, but at some point, if you want to see, they'll go back to the beginning of civilization. And we have recorded incidences all along the way. Did you know even during the Dark Ages that in the monasteries in Europe they were using the herbs? I found that very interesting. All these, we've traced prophecy, at least from Babylon, haven't we, all the way to the end when the Lord comes? And in every one of those nations, Babylon, Greece, Medo-Persia, all of them, all using botanical agents. And these were heathen nations. What about today? Many of the synthetic medicines, not all, not the majority, but many, owe their existence to naturally occurring herbs, plants, and trees. For instance, aspirin comes from a change, obviously, of the phytochemical, but from white willow bark. Quinine from the cinchona tree in Peru. Digitalis from the foxglove plant. Vinblastin, a chemotherapeutic agent from vinca, the vinca plant, periwinkle. Taxotere, another chemotherapeutic agent from the Western Pacific yew, H-E-W. You'll find herbal therapy being used today in Chinese traditional medicine, Native American medicine, osteopathy, naturopathy, Ayurvedic medicine from India. And today in this country we have the complementary and alternative medicines. We have that as a separate department at the National Institutes of Health, NIH. We have a whole separate department that are using and experimenting with these botanical medicines. Now they are using a lot of other things too that we would never use because they don't have the light that we have. A lot of them are spurious. They're brought in under another spirit. I believe there is a pressing need for this resurgence in herbal medicine. And why? Well, we've talked about an ever-escalating incidence of serious adverse drug events. And I'd like just to share some of this information with you. Now, we've talked about Bible, haven't we? We've looked at Spirit of Prophecy councils. We know the warnings that the prophet gave us about drug therapy. Now I want to show you from medical literature itself the cry of alarm at what is happening with drug medications. I'm going to give you this statement. Second selected message, page 450. More deaths have been caused by drug taking than from all other causes combined. If there was in the land one physician in the place of thousands, a vast amount of premature mortality would be prevented. Multitudes of physicians and multitudes of drugs have cursed the inhabitants of this earth and have carried thousands and tens of thousands to untimely graves. Now, is this true today? I have had the privilege of carrying these messages to many places, to different groups, to some of the medical communities. And because our physicians and the physicians of the world